Stephen King was famously dissatisfied by Stanley Kubrick's film of The Shining, although I have to say he is clearly happier, at least at the moment, with the sequel. On Twitter, he said, I know it's quoting the writer of a work that's in the cinema, obviously there's a promotion, but he says on this, Mike Flanagan is a talented director, but also an excellent storyteller. This movie is a good thing. You'll like it if you like The Shining, but you'll also like it if you like Shawshank. It's immersive, which is an interesting comment on it. So essentially what this does is it blends elements of Stephen King's novel and Kubrick's film, iconic elements from Kubrick's film. And it's written and directed by Mike Flanagan, picks up the story of Danny Torrance decades after his escape from an axe-wielding father. I don't think that's any kind of plot spoiler at the end of The Shining, as everyone knows how The Shining ends. As played by Ewan McGregor, he's a wreck. He's struggling with depression and addiction issues. And of course, Danny's key thing was The Shining, the ability to see things which others could not see, which is explained to him for the first time when he arrives at the Overlook Hotel. Of course, there are others out there in the world who have the ability to shine. Danny finds work in a hospice where his power to connect with people telepathically, or at least psychokinetically, is a comfort, hence the Dr. Sleep thing. And then he meets Abra, Carly Curran, who is 13 years old and has similar powers, with whom he is telepathically connected and with whom he feels a kinship. Here's a clip.
You're magic, like me.
I don't know about magic. I always called it The Shining. And yeah, we both shine. Do your parents know?
About my shine? They don't talk about it. Or if I use it, they look at me different.
When I was a kid, I didn't understand The Shining. I called it Tony. Thought he was my imaginary friend.
I thought you were my imaginary friend. For a long time. How many of us are out there?
There's a lot of people who have a little bit of shine, they don't even know it. They always seem to come home with flowers when their wives are sad or they do well in a school test they didn't study for. But I only met 2 or 3 people in my whole life who knew they shined.
I love that thing about, for ages, I thought you were my imaginary friend. So shiners, people who have the shining, are also, it turns out, being sought by a sort of parasitical clan, True Knot, who actually could have stepped out of one of the Twilight films. And again, I don't say that as a criticism because I like the Twilight films, led by Rebecca Ferguson's Rose the Hat, who, as you would guess from the name, wears a sinister hat. And somebody has already tweeted in saying, do you think it's influenced by the Fields of Nephilim?
Fields of Nephilim. Yeah. And she was talking about the hat last week.
She was, yeah, and about the fact that there was only ever one version of it because it was so specifically described. So, essentially, Danny has to step back into the fray in order to fend off this gathering threat. And it's the scene is set for a confrontation. And as I said last week in the interview with Rebecca Ferguson, I don't think it's giving anything away to say that the Overlook features as a character in the third act of the film. We know that's where it's going to lead. Interesting thing about the film is this. I went into it with a great sense of trepidation because people have such high regard for The Shining and it's become such a milestone of modern cinema, and people think of it as modern horror. Many people think it's the scariest film they ever saw, which always surprised me because I never found The Shining scary. I think it's atmospherically interesting, and I think that its sort of portrayal of a family falling apart is, fascinating. But I've never thought it was a scary film. I think there are individual images in it, such as the lift full of blood, such as, what happens when you open the door and you see what's behind the door. I think those images are creepy, but I never actually found the Shining scary. I know other people do. I don't. In the case of this, it really isn't setting out to be a scary film. It has the same sense of damaged childhood that is a theme that runs throughout Stephen King's work. Stephen King's written a lot about young people who have an ability that they don't really understand and that marks them out. So, for example, you think right back to Carrie, when the whole thing with Carrie is that she's telekinetic and her mother therefore thinks that she's cursed, the day that she brought the stones. You think back to Firestarter, which made a terrible film with the Phantom Hairdryer, but it's actually a much better novel. It's not a great novel, but it's an interesting novel about the fact that there is pyrokinetic abilities. And that imperiled childhood and repeated history theme is something which runs throughout Stephen King's work. I mean, Stephen King always related The Shining back to The Haunting of Hill House. The idea in The Haunting of Hill House that the central character goes to a house which is meant to be haunted and kind of discovers that she is the haunting that haunts the house, that she was always there and she will always be there, which is an idea that we see completely replicated in The Shining. Like it, the success of which has pretty much allowed Dr. Sleep to exist, this isn't something which sets out to function primarily as an exercise in fear. It's much more a kind of episodic psychological journey with an interest in that kind of outsider kid thing and what happens when people grow up after outsiderness or traumatic events, what happens with the past when it's moved forward into the future and suddenly you're an adult but you're still having to deal with all the stuff that you were dealing with when you were a kid. As I said, like, there is an odd comparison here with Twilight, which I'm sure that many fans of the film may not appreciate, but I don't mean it as a bad comparison at all, because I think that it has some similar shared ideas, because I think that Twilight is about much more than its detractors would allow. And because there are sections of the film that quote very cheekily from Kubrick's iconic images, there are many times at which the film sets itself up to be knocked down by invoking its comparison with a much-loved predecessor. What I would say about Dr. Sleep is this: I think it's actually pretty good. I went in thinking that it might well be pretty bad because it's, the standard question is, it's a sequel to The Shining. Where are you going to go? I mean, look what happened when you did a sequel to The Exorcist. You got Exorcist II: The Heretic, the stupidest film ever made by anyone ever. It isn't something that I would think of as primarily a horror film. I think of it much more in that kind of Stephen King thing about, as I said, episodic psychological journey. I think it's made by somebody who has a good deal of respect for the original film, but also a good deal of respect for the original text. And if you're a Kubrick fan, if you're a fan of Kubrick's The Shining, you may well really take against it. But if you're a fan of Stephen King, I think you will feel much more sympathetic towards it. And I thought it was much better than I had expected.